Shaquille Big Shaq. O'Neal never thought he'd be treated like a stranger on land he owned. But one call from a racist cop, and his own front lawn became a crime scene. His wife handcuffed, his past buried, his silence louder than any headline. What the world didn't know, the cameras were rolling, and so was his patience. This time, injustice picked the wrong man. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It was just another golden morning in Georgia, until the knock that didn't belong shattered everything. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Cedar Hills estate like warm honey. Sunbeams touched the high ceilings, slipping across the polished marble floors, the quiet fountains outside humming in rhythm with the wind that moved through the pines. Everything looked serene, as if wealth and peace had signed a treaty on this property. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq, to the world stood barefoot in the kitchen, watching the coffee brew. He was still half in sleep mode, wearing an oversized gray hoodie and gym shorts. Yet the way he moved felt like the beginning of something sacred. His fingers lightly tapped the granite countertop, not out of impatience but out of rhythm, like he was syncing his morning with the silence of the house. Shawnee appeared moments later, hair tied loosely, hoodie borrowed from his side of the closet, her hand gently rubbing her eyes as she took her place beside him without a word. They had built a routine without needing to speak. Love, when it's strong enough, communicates in glances and silence. The estate was new. 10 weeks ago, they'd moved in. The mansion wasn't just another extravagant purchase, it was a statement. A black couple living in the heart of old wealth. Cedar Hills had always been predominantly white, historically closed off to change, and carefully manicured in both landscape and culture. But Shaq didn't move here to prove a point. He moved here for peace. Still, he knew the weight he carried. He wasn't just a celebrity. He was a black man in a space that still judged from behind lace curtains and security gates. But even so, he smiled at every neighbor, waved at every gardener, and tipped every delivery driver until their hands trembled in disbelief. His wealth didn't change him, it sharpened his grace. Outside, the day was beginning. Sprinklers hissed. A jogger passed by on the sidewalk, eyes darting toward the house before quickly shifting away. A mother walked her child to the corner where the school bus would arrive. Normal life bloomed around them like wild flowers. Shawnee stepped out to the front patio. Phone in hand, camera up, catching the sunlight against the green hills. She laughed softly at something only she could see through the lens. Shaq followed, leaning on the doorway, arms crossed as he watched her. That's when they heard it. A knock, not a doorbell. A knock, sharp, measured, deliberate. It wasn't a delivery. There were no packages expected. The staff had the day off. The knock felt like something ancient, something that came before reason. Shaq's brows lowered just a little. Shawnee's head tilted. Their eyes met. He stepped forward and opened the door. Two men stood there. One wore jeans, a tucked-in polo, and a scowl polished to perfection. The other, balding, pale, and broad, carried the kind of expression people wore when they were used to getting their way without asking. "Morning," one of them said, not waiting for a response. "Can we help you folks with something?" There was no warmth in his voice, no real question, just a pointed assertion, barely disguised as politeness. They weren't asking Shaq if he needed help. They were implying he shouldn't be there. Shaq leaned against the doorframe, not angry, just present. "This your house?" the second man asked, eyes glancing behind him at the interior. Shawnee, still barefoot, came to stand behind her husband, confusion beginning to bloom across her face. Shaq didn't answer immediately, not because he didn't know what to say, but because the question itself was so bizarre, it needed a moment to exist before it could be dismissed. One of the men reached into his back pocket, not for a weapon, but for a phone. He tapped a button and muttered, "Possible trespassers, Cedar Hills, sending a ping now." That's when it all began to unravel. Shaq stepped out, calm. His presence alone was an answer to the question. But in their eyes, he saw it. They didn't see the NBA legend. They didn't see the millionaire. They saw a black man in a white space, and their assumptions filled in the rest. He raised a hand slightly, a gentle motion. "Everything all right, fellas?" But there were no cameras on them yet. No viral video. No crowds. Just assumptions and silence. The men stood their ground for another minute, before one mumbled something about neighborhood complaints and suspicious activity. They turned and left. Shawnee stared at the driveway long after the men were gone. Her fingers wrapped tightly around her phone, but she hadn't filmed it. She hadn't thought to. Who would expect to be accused of trespassing on their own land? Shaq placed a hand on her shoulder and nodded. It wasn't over, not even close. He knew what was coming, and he knew this wasn't an accident. The community had seen their moving trucks. The neighbors had received the welcome baskets. There had been a block party invitation, ignored by many. Even the country club they applied to had somehow lost their paperwork. Shaq never expected a parade, but he also hadn't expected suspicion to walk right up to his front door dressed in casual wear and entitlement. Inside, the mansion felt colder now. The same sunlight poured in, but its glow felt distant. The couple sat down to finish their coffee, but the rhythm of the day was broken. Down the road, the men who knocked were talking. Their voices weren't raised, but their words carried. "Didn't think he'd answer the door," one said. "Didn't think it was his place," the other replied. Cedar Hills was changing, but not everyone wanted change. That night, Shawnee lay awake, scrolling through community message boards and social chatter. A post had already gone up. "Unfamiliar presence spotted near Hawthorne Drive. Be vigilant." No names, no direct accusations, but the message was clear. Shaq didn't respond. He didn't have to. His presence alone would become the answer. But what no one expected, not the neighbors, not the officers, not even the ones whispering behind closed doors, was that the cameras around the property had recorded every second. High definition, date stamped, stored on cloud servers in real time. He hadn't planned to use them. He never thought he'd need to. But in a town where truth was often bent by perception, video might be the only version of reality that couldn't be ignored. The golden morning was over. Tomorrow would not knock politely. In public, they waved. In private, they planned to erase him. There were no fireworks when Shaq moved into Cedar Hills, no welcome baskets with warm cookies. No notes slipped under doors, no garden parties offering handshakes with Chardonnay. But there were smiles, polished ones, the kind that say "we see you, but never "we know you." In the mornings, Shaq walked the perimeter of his estate. His size and stature were impossible to miss. Broad shoulders above manicured hedges, a silhouette that seemed out of place against the uniform brick facades and pastel shutters. From across the road, neighbors pretended not to stare. Lawn sprinklers continued to spray. Leashed dogs continued their reluctant trots. But behind the stillness, suspicion whispered. Shawnee noticed it first. A mail carrier switching her usual route. A florist suddenly hesitant to park in their driveway. The dry cleaner who stopped offering pickup service. Minor shifts, but in neighborhoods like Cedar Hills, subtle was the language of exclusion. At the edge of the community, just beyond a black iron gate marked "private entrance only," stood a house older than the rest, larger, more fortress than home. It belonged to Douglas Ware, a retired police sergeant and lifelong Cedar Hills resident. His yard bore no flowers, no Halloween decorations, no welcome mat, but his blinds always twitched when Shaq's SUV pulled into the driveway. His porch light came on, even in daylight. Douglas had lived through changing America, through civil rights marches and riots, through integration and backlash. He survived those years not by understanding them, but by outlasting them. In his world, order came from knowing your place, and in his eyes, Shaq was wildly out of place. One Tuesday evening, under the soft buzz of porch fans and the faint smell of citrus candles, a meeting was held at the home of the Homeowners Association president. It was supposed to be about routine matters, lawn regulations, parking enforcement, the new recycling policy. But the conversation veered, as it often did these days. "He doesn't belong here," murmured someone over a half-finished Pinot. "Did you see the footage?" Another woman chimed in, her voice sugary but sharp. "I heard his wife yelled at the officers, right on her front lawn." Douglas leaned forward, resting his hand on the oak table. "He's a public figure, with public problems. Brings attention we never asked for." "Do you think he's dangerous?" someone asked, more curious than concerned. "No," Douglas said slowly. "But visibility isn't innocence, and sometimes good fences make better neighbors for everyone." That sentence became a seed. It rooted itself in their minds, twisting into justifications, unspoken biases, and carefully worded complaints. Over the next few days, Cedar Hills began to buzz, not loudly, but persistently. Anonymous tips were sent to the HOA about unusual late-night visitors. A few homeowners requested additional patrols, citing property safety. Some even questioned whether Shaq had met all zoning requirements for his backyard gym. The rumors weren't outrageous, they were insidious, whispers wrapped in concern, gossip draped in etiquette. Shaq knew none of this yet. He spent his days working on foundation plans for underprivileged schools, planning youth camps, and recording motivational content for inner-city kids. At home, he and Shawnee were designing a community library space, a converted wing on the east side of their home, a place for local kids, regardless of background, to read and learn. But their vision didn't match the unspoken mission of Cedar Hills, where everything had a place, and where place was often determined by history more than merit. On Friday morning, the first real sign of escalation arrived. A letter, folded in thirds, taped quietly to the front gate. It wasn't addressed. It wasn't signed. It read, "Respect your fame. Live where it fits." Shawnee read it 3 times before placing it on the kitchen table. Her eyes said what her mouth refused to. She didn't cry, but her hands didn't stop shaking for minutes after. Shaq stared at the note. He didn't curse. He didn't shout. He just folded it neatly and placed it in the drawer where they kept property documents. He'd grown up with this kind of ugliness, but the packaging had changed. It was no longer burning crosses and shouted slurs. It was HOA clauses, quiet letters, and altered delivery schedules. That evening, Douglas Ware sat in his study, watching replays of local news. The footage from the earlier incident was making its rounds again, this time spliced, edited, with commentary. He sipped bourbon and leaned back, the blue glow reflecting off his glasses. The world was watching. But he still thought the neighborhood could handle this themselves. He wasn't interested in fame or lawsuits. He was interested in Cedar Hills staying the way he remembered it, predictable, quiet, and untouched. So he started digging. Through old records, service reports, archived interviews, anything that could be used to create a paper trail of concern. He reached out to someone he knew in the department, a friend still wearing the badge. Just casual questions, just curiosity, he claimed. By the weekend, strange things began happening. Shaq's trash bins weren't collected. Packages from regular vendors stopped arriving. An inspection notice appeared on their garage door. All of it plausible, all of it deliberate. At the HOA, more letters surfaced. Not from Douglas this time, but others emboldened by his silence. They complained of noise from the property, of unregulated structures, of concerns for long-term neighborhood integrity. Shaq and Shawnee remained outwardly calm. They maintained their smiles, continued waving to the few neighbors who responded, and even hosted a charity brunch, though only 2 people came. One left before dessert. The pressure didn't break them, but it isolated them. Shaq began spending more time on the back deck, staring into the tree line. His mornings were quieter now, his walks more frequent. He noticed more things: how long cars parked near their gate, how often people slowed down when passing the house. In his journal, Shaq began documenting dates, incidents, names, when he could remember them. He wasn't collecting them out of fear. He was preparing for something he felt growing, a shift in energy, an inevitability. Shawnee, on the other hand, buried herself in plans. She redesigned the community wing layout, reached out to local librarians, began curating a book list focused on empowerment, identity, and justice. She refused to let hostility shrink her purpose. But then came the drone. It buzzed just once, hovering over their pool late one afternoon. Shaq spotted it first, stepping out just in time to catch it lowering briefly, angling toward the house, then lifting and vanishing over the rooftops. That night, he installed additional security, cameras with motion sensors, audio pickups, thermal range. He told Shawnee it was just precaution, but she knew better. The mansion at Cedar Hills was no longer a home. It had become a symbol, and symbols, especially black ones in white spaces, often became targets. What Douglas didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Shaq's story wasn't new. It was a repetition of patterns he had grown up around. But this time, he wasn't a child. He wasn't poor. He wasn't voiceless. He had tools, resources, and most importantly, patience. He would not confront. Not yet. Instead, he would wait. Because the next knock wouldn't come from neighbors. It would come with sirens. And this time, everything would be recorded. He wasn't on duty, but his badge still bled power. The afternoon sun sat heavy on Cedar Hills, casting long golden streaks across the sidewalks and rooftops. It was the kind of light that made everything look more expensive. Each window pane gleaming like glass dipped in champagne, each lawn glowing like a manicured illusion of peace. But beneath the polish, the neighborhood hummed with quiet tension. Shaq and Shawnee had just returned from a walk. It wasn't planned or ceremonial, just one of their usual circuits around the estate grounds, holding iced teas in hand, talking about plans for the garden, a mural Shawnee wanted to commission, and the guest house renovations they hoped to convert into a youth center. They laughed about the wild bunnies nesting near the hedges, and debated whether deer fencing would ruin the visual flow of the back lawn. Just another day, just another walk. But in Cedar Hills, context didn't always travel with truth. Brent Callahan drove by at precisely 3:42 p.m. His cruiser was unmarked today. Personal vehicle, dark gray with a county sticker, barely visible near the rear bumper. He wasn't on shift, but the badge in his wallet didn't know the difference, and neither did he. He had grown up just 2 towns over. He remembered Cedar Hills before the security gates and landscape architects. Before the property values surged, he remembered who used to live here, and more importantly, who didn't. Brent slowed as he neared the O'Neill estate. He saw 2 figures walking across the grass, stepping through the side garden toward the back patio. At first, they were too far for him to make out. But then the man turned, sunlight catching that unmistakable silhouette, and Brent's jaw tightened. He didn't stop the car. He didn't get out. Instead, he reached for the mounted radio in the center console. His fingers hovered for a second, then pressed. Unit Bravo 3. Possible trespassers at 301 Hawthorne Lane. 2 individuals, moving along the west side of property. Requesting visual confirmation. Potential property code violation. Over. He didn't identify them, didn't say he knew who it was. But he knew, and he knew exactly how vague language worked in his favor. From a nearby patrol zone, 2 squad cars responded. They weren't racing. No lights, no sirens. Just quiet escalation. Shawnee had just turned to go inside when the first vehicle pulled in. She paused at the threshold, confused at the unfamiliar cruiser slowly creeping into their private driveway. Shaq stepped forward, his expression steady but unreadable. A second cruiser slid in seconds later, blocking the gate exit. 2 officers stepped out. One adjusted his vest. The other placed his hand near his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough to make the message clear. Neither wore a smile. Shaq didn't move from the steps. The officers looked at each other, unsure. Their body cams were on. They'd been told to confirm a trespassing report. But what they found was a man who needed no introduction, and a woman who stood calmly beside him, eyes narrowed in controlled disbelief. One of the officers raised a notepad. We received a call about a disturbance. Mind if we… Shawnee didn't answer. She pointed to the security camera mounted above the garage arch, then to the one near the side lantern, then to a third half hidden behind ivy on the balcony railing. The officers hesitated. Shaq nodded once, slow and firm, then turned to walk inside. There were no raised voices, no handcuffs, but the message had already landed, like a cold gust slipping under the doorframe. The cruisers left 7 minutes later. But across the street, Brent Callahan watched from the edge of his vehicle, parked behind a hedge just 2 houses down. His eyes tracked the entire event, not with satisfaction, but with calculation. To him, this wasn't a confrontation. It was a message, a test. He wanted to see how the system would respond when the spotlight wasn't turned on. Inside the house, Shawnee sat at the dining table, scrolling through the home surveillance app. She found the exact timestamp, 3:42. The gray car slowing near the gate. The glimpse of a face partially obscured by sunglasses. Shaq reviewed the same footage in his office, watching the timing of each cruiser, each body movement, each word captured by the directional mics. He cataloged it like he was studying game tape, not for aggression, but for pattern, for what wasn't said, for what could be misinterpreted, reshaped, weaponized. The home didn't feel violated, it felt surrounded, not by violence, but by suspicion cloaked in legality. Later that evening, the HOA inbox received 3 new reports: increased patrol presence on Hawthorne Lane. Community appreciates responsiveness. One report claimed the couple had been seen walking near a restricted fence area. Another raised concern about possible unregistered household staff wandering grounds. Nothing concrete, nothing prosecutable, but enough to keep the embers alive. Brent's radio remained silent for the rest of the day, but his mind wasn't. He wasn't acting out of spontaneity. He'd been watching the situation for weeks. The online conversations, the residents' subtle frustrations, the meeting murmurs, all of it confirmed something he already believed deep down. Some people didn't belong, no matter how many millions they had. He told himself he was protecting the community, that if Shaq had nothing to hide, he wouldn't mind scrutiny. He told himself he was just doing his job, even if he wasn't officially on it. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't see, was that his voice on the radio had already been picked up and logged. The radio channel he used wasn't encrypted, and in Shaq's home, one of the surveillance systems had picked up the external radio frequency. A coincidence, a technological overlap, but now it was evidence. Shaq didn't speak of it that night. Not to Shawnee, not to anyone. Instead, he sat at the edge of the backyard fountain, eyes fixed on the still water. A frog sat on the edge of a lily pad nearby, oblivious to the world unraveling around it. He watched it for minutes, mind quiet, rage buried under layers of reflection. He had always known racism could wear a uniform, but in Cedar Hills it wore collars and badges. hosted HOA dinners, and filed anonymous complaints with smiles on their faces. The power Brent carried wasn't the weapon on his hip. It was the silent endorsement of a system that let him blur the line between authority and bias. That line had now been crossed, but not in the way he expected. Shaq wasn't planning revenge. He was preparing a record. And somewhere in the stillness of that evening, a shift began. Not loud, not explosive. Just the subtle click of a surveillance file being uploaded to a secure server. Because what Brent didn't realize was that this wasn't the first time Shaq had been falsely accused. It was just the first time someone with power would regret it. Injustice doesn't need a courtroom. It just needs a uniform and a lie. It started with 3 knocks on the front door. This time louder, sharper. This time with backup. The morning air was still warm from the rising sun. The lawn freshly mowed just hours before. Shaq was inside, finishing up a protein shake in the kitchen. Shawnee had stepped outside to answer a text, standing barefoot again on the cobblestone path that wrapped around the koi pond. She was mid-laugh, reading something from her sister, when the cruisers pulled in. 2 this time, parked not at the curb, but inside the gate, like the property was theirs to breach. The motion sensors flickered, the AI alert triggered, but before any alert made it to the household's notifications, the doors had opened, and 2 uniformed officers were already walking up the path. They didn't announce themselves, didn't request identification. One officer radioed in, eyes never leaving Shawnee. The other approached with handcuffs already visible. Shaq looked out through the front window as he rinsed his glass. He moved quickly, but didn't run. Rushing, in situations like this, could be mistaken for aggression. And in Cedar Hills, there were no mistakes, only justifications. By the time he stepped out onto the porch, one officer had already asked Shawnee to step away from the premises. She laughed, not understanding. But it wasn't a joke. Not this time. Another cruiser arrived at the gate, 3 officers now, one with a body cam blinking red, one with a clipboard, and one moving toward Shawnee, with the kind of steady motion reserved for suspects, not citizens. She asked what this was about. The answer didn't come. Instead, the officer closest to her reached forward, took her arm with a practiced grip, and twisted it gently behind her back. She didn't resist, not because she wasn't furious, but because she'd been taught, like so many others, that resistance was a currency she couldn't afford. Her phone dropped onto the grass, its screen still lit. Across the street, a woman who had barely nodded at them in months raised her phone to record. Another neighbor peeked from behind a curtain, then slipped out onto the driveway to check the mailbox. The performance had begun. Shaq stepped down from the porch, arms raised, not in surrender, but in control. "What's happening here?" he asked. Not with his voice, but with the set of his shoulders, the calm in his face, the power he held without raising it. The officer holding Shawnee avoided his eyes. Another one stepped in, asking for identification. Shaq pointed to the monogram on the gate, the mailbox engraved with O'Neill, and the security badge just feet away. But it didn't matter. One of the officers had received a call, a report of trespassers. A man and woman, no names, no confirmed identities, just enough suspicion to justify presence. When the handcuffs clicked shut, Shawnee looked at her husband with eyes that held a mix of disbelief and betrayal. Not from him, but from a world that still couldn't see her humanity. Shaq didn't raise his voice, didn't curse. Instead, he asked calmly, "Are your body cams on?" That question shifted something. The officers hesitated. One checked. Another tapped his vest. Shaq turned slightly and pointed up toward the security camera hidden beneath the second-story eave. "You're being recorded too," he said. Not as a threat, but as a reminder. The lead officer shifted his weight. His partner made a quick call. Minutes passed. The third cruiser, which had stayed idle, began to back out slowly. Shawnee stood still, wrists bound, her breath controlled but sharp. The cuffs weren't tight enough to injure, but tight enough to humiliate. By the time they confirmed the ownership records and the officers began to loosen the cuffs, it was too late. The damage had taken root, not in bruises, but in perception, in visibility, in the violation of being criminalized in one's own yard. Shawnee didn't speak as they removed the cuffs. She didn't thank them. She didn't ask for an explanation. She simply walked past them, retrieved her phone from the grass, and disappeared into the house. Shaq followed, slower, his eyes scanning the perimeter, watching phones go back into pockets, watching the front porch across the street empty out. Everyone had been watching, and now everyone had seen exactly what they wanted to see. An incident. By nightfall, the video was on social media, not the high-definition security feed, not yet, but the phone footage from across the street. Grainy, cropped, slanted through rose bushes. The narrative took shape in comments and captions. Man and woman questioned by police after suspicious behavior reported in Cedar Hills. Shaq involved in property dispute. Police respond to call at NBA legend's estate. No one asked about the officer's conduct. No one questioned the legality of detaining a woman without identifying her or reading her rights. The internet had already picked sides. Some defended the couple. Others mocked. But the most dangerous reactions were from those who shrugged, who called it standard protocol, who saw nothing wrong. But what they didn't know, what not even the officers had realized, was that the O'Neill estate's AI system had captured everything. The front yard lens had a dual feed, one in wide angle and one in facial tracking mode. The sound captured full audio, clear enough to pick up the murmured line from one officer to another. Just play it safe. Treat 'em like unknowns, rich or not. Shaq sat in his study that night, the lights dimmed, the footage replaying silently on the monitor. Shawnee was in the bath, eyes closed, headphones on, trying to wash off something far deeper than dirt. The footage was clean, clear, precise, but he didn't release it, not yet. Because releasing it too soon would turn the story into a spectacle. And this wasn't a spectacle. This was a pattern, one that had played out across cities, suburbs, neighborhoods like this for generations. Only this time it wore khakis instead of riot gear. Instead, he copied the footage to a secure drive, sent a backup to his legal advisor, another to his foundation's director, one more to a journalist he trusted, an old friend who didn't need permission to do what was right. He named the file Incident 1. He wasn't angry in the traditional sense. He was methodical, calculated, not vengeful, but unwilling to let this pass as another footnote in a long history of swallowed stories. The next morning, Shawnee emerged with her head held high, her wrists bare but still aching. They didn't talk about it over breakfast. There were no breakdowns, no rants, only silence that said more than words. Across town, Officer Brent Callahan sat at his desk, sipping black coffee, scrolling through headlines. He saw the clip, the grainy video. He smiled faintly. To him it looked like control had been re-established, that the system was still in motion. But what he didn't know was that the real footage was already in hands that wouldn't sit still. The accusation had echoed, but the truth hadn't spoken yet. And when it did, it wouldn't knock. It would roar. They called him a thug, a fraud, a squatter. Until someone looked closer. The morning after the handcuffing incident, the O'Neill estate was quiet, but the world outside had become a storm of scrolls, swipes, and speculation. On Twitter, the footage had already reached over 2 million views. On Instagram, cropped images of Shawnee being restrained were looped and filtered, often posted without captions, as if the visual alone confirmed a narrative that didn't require context. Former NBA star detained, one headline read. Suspicious activity at celebrity mansion, said another. Even the more reputable outlets used language laced with implications. Security confusion. Ownership dispute. Police respond to elite suburb alarm. None of them called it what it was, racial profiling. The spin was slow but deliberate. Terms like incident, neighborhood patrol, and unverified identities circled like sharks. Comment sections festered. Some called it fake outrage. Others questioned whether Shaq and Shawnee had really owned the house. You can rent luxury, one user typed, but you can't buy belonging. From behind the digital veil, trolls crafted stories the world wanted to believe that Shaq was aggressive, that Shawnee had threatened the officers, that the cops were just doing their job. No one questioned why an affluent black couple would be seen as strangers on land they paid for in full. In a downtown Atlanta newsroom, between cold coffee cups and too many open tabs, Layla Monroe sat staring at the footage, her headphones pressed tightly against her ears. Layla wasn't new to stories like this. As a senior investigative journalist, she'd covered racial tension long before it became profitable for mainstream channels. But something about this story didn't sit right. Not just the footage itself, but the way it spread. It was too synchronized, too tidy. The same buzzwords repeated across different outlets, as if choreographed. She replayed the clip again. Shawnee's face, calm, stunned. Shaq's posture, composed, measured. The officers? Not tense, just routine. Their body language told a different story than the captions framed. And in the background, a man's voice murmured, just out of frame. Looks like they got caught. Layla muted the video. That voice hadn't been identified in any of the social media shares. But her trained ear caught a hint of distance, a muffled echo that suggested he wasn't part of the arrest, he was a bystander. Maybe even the one who recorded it. She did what journalists do best. She followed the metadata. The original post had come from an account named @CedarTruth, anonymous, Private, no bio, 3 followers. The first upload timestamped just minutes after the officers left the property. But what stood out was the angle filmed from a high elevation, not from the street, from above. She opened Google Maps, searching for 301 Hawthorne Lane. Then she traced surrounding homes, looking for vantage points. Only one house had a balcony facing directly toward the O'Neill lawn, a house with a turret-style third-floor sitting room, registered to Douglas Ware. The name meant nothing to her yet, but something about it sparked curiosity. Meanwhile, at the O'Neill estate, Shawnee moved like a woman rebuilding a shattered mirror, calm, meticulous, but different. She'd stopped checking social media, not out of defeat but to avoid the pull of a narrative that didn't belong to her. Shaq, meanwhile, had become more reserved. He started reviewing legal documents with a quiet focus, not aggressive, strategic. He hadn't released the high-definition security footage, but he'd shared it, selectively, quietly, with people who wouldn't use it for clicks or applause. One of those people was Layla Monroe. Her phone buzzed that afternoon with a secure file transfer link labeled O'Neill Primary Source Footage. She didn't hesitate. Downloaded. Watched. The difference between the grainy viral video and the full security footage was night and day. On the 4K feed, you could hear the officer's breath, see the hesitation in their eyes when they recognized who they were detaining. You could hear the line clearly, "Treat 'em like unknowns." Layla froze. That phrase wasn't procedural. It was coded language. She cross-referenced it with her archive of police radio chatter from previous coverage. The same phrase had appeared in 2 unrelated incidents involving racial misidentification, both swept under departmental reviews with no formal punishment. Then she dug deeper. She traced the responding officer's report times. The initial call was placed at 3:42 p.m. She requested public dispatch logs for that hour, scanning for caller ID codes and vehicle sightings. That's when she found him. Callahan. Bayahan. The name leapt from the report like a bruise on clean skin. Brent Callahan. She remembered that name. He'd been involved in a previous incident in 2017, an off-duty altercation with a young black student misidentified as a robbery suspect in a grocery store. Charges were dropped, but the department quietly suspended him for 30 days. It never made headlines. But Layla had the original case file. She never forgot the quiet ones. Callahan's name wasn't listed in the current report, but the footage, the timing, and the proximity painted a story without needing confession. He was watching them, and he had set the gears in motion. Layla called her editor. "I have something real," she said. "Shaq real, or legal firestorm real?" the editor asked. "Both," she replied. "But we can't lead with outrage. We need to lead with receipts." Back in Cedar Hills, the pressure on Shaq and Shawnee hadn't let up, but something had shifted in the air. People who hadn't spoken to them in weeks suddenly smiled at the grocery store. A neighbor left fresh lemons on the front porch without a note. The HOA sent a vague, non-apologetic statement of miscommunication, clarifying that they valued community integrity while reaffirming their commitment to safety. It was performative, but it was a crack in the wall. Shaq didn't respond publicly. He still hadn't posted, still hadn't released the video, but he'd read Layla's message, and he'd seen the draft of the article she was preparing to publish. She titled it, "The Echo That Lied: How Race, Power, and Assumption Shaped a False Narrative in Cedar Hills." It wasn't sensational, it was surgical. A quiet dismantling of the systemic framework that allowed this moment to happen, and how close it came to erasing truth under the weight of assumption. Layla didn't ask for permission. She asked for patience. She wanted to get it right. Shaq agreed. The internet had lit the match, but now someone was finally willing to carry the torch without burning down the truth. The truth was buried under dust and sealed folders, but it was still breathing. Layla Monroe wasn't sleeping much. Her desk was buried in printouts, audio logs, cross-referenced police complaints, and timeline charts. The more she uncovered, the more she realized the problem wasn't the video. It was the pattern. Cedar Hills was just the latest symptom of a deeper infection. She was 3 layers into the database, an old law enforcement disciplinary archive she'd pulled through a contact in records when she found it. Callahan, Brent D. Incident number 1475, CA. Status, closed. Administrative warning. Summary, off-duty altercation, misidentification, no charges filed, suspension 30 days. But that wasn't the only one. There were 2 others, both classified under improper conduct, profiling inquiry, both internally dismissed. The language was always the same: insufficient evidence, contextual ambiguity, no formal breach of conduct. But when she read between the lines, it was obvious: pattern surveillance, Questionable stops, unrecorded verbal warnings, anonymous complaints from black residents, all leading nowhere. Each file felt like another breath the system forgot to take. Cases suffocated before they could speak. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion wrestling with adrenaline. The narrative was starting to thread itself together, but something was still missing, something bigger than the paperwork. Then the envelope arrived. No sender, just her name, typed in courier font, hand-delivered to the newsroom with no return address. Inside, a single USB drive taped to the back of a yellow sticky note. On the note, 5 words, use this when they deny it. She plugged it in, one folder, one file, titled, Kamsepsek, full unedited, .mp4. She clicked play. It was the full surveillance footage from the day Shawnee had been cuffed, but not the version Shaq had sent her. This one included 4 additional minutes showing the cruiser pulling in early, the officer speaking to someone off camera behind a bush line, and a clear voice radioing in.
Looks like our visitors are back. Same too. Not confirmed. Send backup. I'll stay at visual range.
Then the camera shifted. It caught a reflection. Not clear, but clear enough. A silver badge chain, a county plate number on a parked civilian car across the street, and a figure leaning into a small handheld radio with practiced ease. It was Brent Callahan. He wasn't assigned to the patrol. He wasn't on duty, but he was there, and he had called it in. Layla froze the frame, zoomed, matched the plate number. It was a registered off-duty vehicle, assigned to him through the county's optional patrol privilege program. The narrative was no longer a theory. It was provable. She attached the full footage to a new cloud vault, labeled it primary evidence, Callahan incident. Then, out of instinct, she called Shaq. She didn't expect him to answer, but he did. Calm, brief. I didn't send that version, he said. I figured. I didn't know who would, he added, and that's when Layla understood something else. This wasn't just about exposure. It was about something older, something buried. While she worked to verify the footage's source, something unexpected arrived at Shaq's estate. A manila envelope slid beneath the gate overnight. No postage, no label. Inside, a worn letter, folded 3 times, and a hospital statement dated 2002. The letter was handwritten. Dear Mr. O'Neill, you don't know me. I'm not asking for anything. But I was told by someone at the department that you helped cover the cost of my son's emergency surgery last spring. I just wanted to say thank you. I don't know what made you do it. I don't think you even wanted credit. But I was drowning, and you reached out like a ghost. My son is alive because of you. D. Callahan. Shaq stood in the hallway reading it slowly, piecing together a memory buried under years of silent giving. He'd covered medical expenses for dozens of families, many anonymously, many through backdoor channels. But this one hit different. He remembered now. The donation had gone through a local foundation. A rookie cadet in the academy had a severe heart condition. No insurance. His father, a decorated officer, had reached out to a mutual contact. Shaq paid the bill in full, on the condition of anonymity. That cadet was Brent Callahan. The same man now trying to erase him. Shaq didn't get angry, not in the way most would. His reaction was colder, deeper, like steel beneath ice. Because now this wasn't just about racism. It wasn't just about profiling. It was about betrayal, about being seen not as a man, but as a threat, even by someone he once saved. He took the letter and placed it on his office desk next to the drive Layla had mentioned. He didn't text her. He didn't call back. He simply forwarded the file to his attorney. Meanwhile, Layla made her next move. She drafted an email to the city's civilian oversight board, attaching both versions of the footage. She included her documentation of Callahan's prior complaints. She didn't make demands. She presented evidence. She made it impossible to look away. The next day, the story ran. Not as a viral headline, not as a meme or montage. It was a long-form piece published in the Chronicle Observer, titled, Invisible Line, How Power, Gratitude, and Race Collided in Cedar Hills. It included everything. The complaints, the full video, the history, the donation. Readers weren't ready for it. Neither were the city's PR teams. But it was too clean, too documented to bury. Social media imploded. This time not with mockery, but with reflection. He tried to help the man who came for him. Shaq saved him. He tried to erase that. This is America in a single metaphor. In a press conference 2 days later, a department spokesperson confirmed that Officer Callahan had been placed on indefinite administrative leave pending internal investigation. They refused further questions. Cameras flashed. Reporters barked. But the public had already formed its verdict. And Callahan, for the first time, had no badge to hide behind. Back at the mansion, Shaq watched the press conference in silence. Shawnee sat beside him, holding the letter from 2002, like it was a confession from a past that refused to stay buried. He finally exhaled. Not in relief, but in release. Because the system had moved, not because it wanted to. But because this time, the truth had documentation. America was watching now, and silence had become a liability. The story had cracked open, and there was no closing it. By the time the footage made it to national morning news, it had already become a symbol, not just of racism, not just of injustice, but of what it meant to be both seen and unseen in a country where fame didn't guarantee protection and silence was no longer neutral. Cable anchors debated the footage frame by frame, while think pieces sprouted like weeds across the internet. Words like implicit bias, unconscious racism, and systemic profiling floated over living room televisions and dinner tables across America. But at the center of the firestorm sat a single, inescapable truth. A man once hailed for breaking backboards had been mistaken for breaking into his own home, and the man who triggered it had once owed his life to him. Outside the O'Neill estate, a crowd began to form. Not angry, not yelling, just there. They gathered with posters that read, "We believe you," and owned an accused. College students, neighbors from nearby towns, even older civil rights veterans from decades past. They didn't chant, they occupied. Quiet presence, feet grounded, hands steady, signs raised like signals sent into a world still pretending not to hear. At first, Cedar Hills tried to pretend it wasn't happening. Cars took alternate routes, lawn chairs vanished from porches, neighborhood watch texts doubled in volume, warning of outside activity and urging homeowners to stay alert. But the pressure kept mounting. Former police chiefs started weighing in. One, retired from a nearby district, went viral for saying, "If a man like Shaquille O'Neal can be treated this way in his own neighborhood, then we've built a system that doesn't recognize anything but fear." Celebrities followed. Not just athletes, actors, authors, comedians. Even a tech CEO reposted the article Layla Monroe had written, calling it the most damning example of silent racism I've seen in a decade. Meanwhile, Brent Callahan hadn't been seen in days. His house sat silent, blinds drawn, the cruiser gone from the driveway. But inside, Brent was unraveling. Not publicly, not dramatically, but privately. He'd read the stories, he saw the comments. The letter from his father had resurfaced, now scanned and circulated as a digital artifact of irony and shame. The man who once considered himself a silent guardian was now the face of a broken pattern. And worse, it was personal. The department placed him on official suspension. Internal Affairs launched a deeper probe. Not because they wanted to, but because public pressure had given them no other option. His badge sat in a drawer now, cold, lifeless. At the HOA, emergency meetings were called. Some members pushed to release a community statement of apology. Others resisted, claiming neutrality. One neighbor openly suggested filing a nuisance complaint against the demonstrators. "It's affecting home values," she whispered. But the damage wasn't economic. It was cultural and irreversible. Cedar Hills had become a headline, and headlines didn't fade with sprinklers and pressure-washed sidewalks. Inside the O'Neill mansion, Shawnee stood at the front window, watching the people beyond the gate. She didn't cry, she didn't smile, she just watched, silent and still, as if absorbing every face into her memory. Shaq stood behind her, arms crossed. "They're not here for a show," she said finally. "They're here because they know what this means." He nodded. "They're tired too," he added. Later that evening, Shaq posted for the first time since the story broke. No video, no speech, just a single image, the original letter from Brent's father, signed and folded beside a screen capture of the radio dispatch log bearing Callahan's ID. Caption: "I never needed credit, but I won't be invisible either." The post exploded. 24 hours later, the mayor of Atlanta released a statement calling the incident deeply troubling and announced plans to expand community accountability programs for off-duty police behavior. Still, not everyone applauded. Within Cedar Hills, the protests caused friction, not just between neighbors, but within households. Some saw the movement as disruptive, others liberating. Some kept their curtains closed, others stood outside their homes, handing out water to protesters, struggling to reconcile decades of passive complicity with the moment pressing against their gates. Layla Monroe continued to publish. Her next article, titled "The Gated Mirage: Race, Property, and Public Imagination," dissected the deep psychological legacy of neighborhoods like Cedar Hills, how property lines became symbolic lines, and how whiteness was still silently coded into HOA bylaws and unwritten expectations. The city paper ran it on the front page. Her inbox flooded, half thank yous, half threats. But she kept going. She knew something fundamental had shifted. Not in systems yet, but in consciousness. In exposure. The story had forced America to confront a question it often danced around. What does safety really mean? And who gets to define it? At night, Shaq would walk the perimeter of the estate again. Not out of paranoia. Not even caution. Just practice. Each step meant something. Now. He waved to the protesters. Some waved back. Some nodded solemnly, knowing their presence wasn't fixing the world, but it was interrupting the lie that everything was fine. Shawnee started writing again. Not emails. Not interviews. A book. She hadn't told anyone, not even Shaq, but she titled the document, "The Garden We Were Never Meant to Grow." It began not with the cuffs or the knock, but with a line that said, "They smiled at us, but not with us." The noise wouldn't die, because it was never noise to begin with. It was grief, pride, memory, exhaustion, fire. And this time, it had witnesses. Lucille O'Neill had seen injustice before, but not like this. Lucille O'Neill didn't speak often in public these days. She left that to her son, to the movements, to the camera-ready voices that the world had grown accustomed to listening to. But that didn't mean she wasn't watching, and remembering. She watched the chaos swirl on TV, her son's face framed by headlines she'd spent her life hoping he'd never be part of. She saw the cuffs on Shawnee, the silence in Shaq's eyes, the crowds outside the gate, and the digital noise echoing what she'd once been forced to live quietly. And she remembered Newark. The scent of diesel smoke mixed with fried onions from the street vendors. A city still smoldering from the riots of a decade prior, where race wasn't a headline, it was a weight, a daily fact pressed onto your chest from the minute your feet hit the sidewalk. She remembered walking Shaquille to the corner store, a toddler gripping her fingers with chubby, curious hands. How she used to dress him in the brightest colors she could afford so no one could ever say, "I didn't see him." She remembered the security guard at the supermarket, who followed them down every aisle. The white landlord who refused to fix their radiator in the dead of winter. The school principal who asked her once, "Are you sure he's reading at grade level?" when Shaq was already 2 grades ahead. Now decades later, with her son living behind iron gates and 7-figure property lines, it was still happening. The scenery had changed, the insult hadn't. Lucille didn't cry. She didn't rage. Instead, she opened the wooden trunk at the foot of her bed, pulled out a worn leather-bound journal, and began flipping through the pages. Her handwriting looped, steady, anchored in time, filled each page like scripture written in resilience. Not rants, not laments, but records of every slight, every lesson, every memory that made her the woman she became and raised the man the world now revered. On page 148, dated July 12, 1992, she wrote, "I told him the world will love your game but fear your name. Stay kind, stay clear, stay ready." On page 203, Shaq asked me today why people stare at us in restaurants. I told him, some people never saw black families eat with joy before. On page 356, after his draft day, "The flashbulbs make you look invincible, but I see the boy who still wants to protect me from the world." Her writing wasn't meant for public eyes. It was therapy, legacy, her way of marking time in a world that tried to erase stories like hers. But now, for the first time, she felt the urge to let others read it. Not to expose, but to connect. To anchor this whirlwind in something older than hashtags and headlines. She mailed 3 photocopied chapters to Layla Monroe, with a handwritten note clipped to the cover. "You want the truth? Here's where it started." When Layla read the journal entries, she sat in silence for almost an hour. Then she wrote the next installment of her series. Not about footage, not about legal breakdowns, but about Lucille. About the architecture of motherhood in a broken system. About what it means to raise black children in a country where presence is too often treated as threat. The article was titled, "Through Her Eyes, The Woman Who Raised a Giant the World Feared Anyway." It went viral within 6 hours. Mothers reposted it, educators printed it, libraries requested permission to archive it. Within days, a publisher contacted Lucille with a proposal to publish the full journals in a memoir collection. She didn't say yes right away. She didn't care about fame. She cared about message. She called Shaq that night, her voice steady but low. "Son," she said, "I'm not telling this story because of what they did to you. I'm telling it because of what you didn't do. You didn't let it turn you mean. You didn't let it make you small." Shaq didn't speak for a while. Then he just said, "It's time, Ma." So she said yes. She began selecting entries, revising a few for clarity, but keeping the language intact. No editorials, no dramatics, just truth, unvarnished and lived. Back in Cedar Hills, word of the journal began to circulate. Some neighbors who had never said a word now looked away awkwardly at the mailbox. Others dropped off notes. One said, "I had no idea your family's been through so much." Shawnee scoffed when she read it. "Of course they didn't," she said. "They never asked." But even as the neighborhood remained divided, the emotional tone of the country was changing, not because of outrage, because of recognition. Lucille's voice brought depth to the story that no footage could provide. It reminded people that what happened in Cedar Hills wasn't an isolated moment. It was a thread in a much older fabric. She was invited to speak on a nationally televised panel about generational trauma. She wore a dark blue dress and a silver necklace Shaq had given her years ago after a championship game. She spoke slowly, deliberately, like someone used to being ignored, and now determined to be understood. "I raised a boy who became a man the world couldn't handle with grace. But what hurts me most is not that they did this to my family. It's that they still don't think it matters. They think it's a moment. It's not. It's a memory. And memories don't die." The clip trended for 3 days. Activist groups printed her quote on signs. Universities requested to license her material for inclusion in African American studies programs. An entire high school class in Detroit used her entries as the foundation for a creative writing unit titled Documenting the Unspoken. Lucille didn't chase the limelight. She just kept telling the truth. And in doing so, she grounded the entire movement, not in theory, but in blood, in upbringing, in the complicated, often invisible labor of black motherhood that shaped men like Shaq long before the world ever knew their names. Shaq, now watching the country respond to her, felt something shift in him too. He realized that while the protesters outside were making noise and the articles were drawing attention, it was her voice that had broken through the noise. Not with fury, but with memory. Because it wasn't the footage that made America pause. It was the mother who remembered, and made us remember with her. Sometimes the biggest enemy isn't the man with the badge, it's the man in the mirror. Brent Callahan hadn't left his house in 9 days. The curtains stayed drawn. The mail piled up on the front porch. The police cruiser he once drove with pride now sat idle in the garage, its siren stripped, its decals scraped off by request. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was claustrophobic, the kind that crawled up walls and circled your thoughts like a vulture waiting for you to admit it was over. Outside, the world had moved on from rumor to evidence, from questions to consequences. He watched it all unfold on a 12-inch kitchen TV that barely picked up news channels anymore. The signal cut in and out, but the message was loud and clear. Shaq hadn't retaliated. He hadn't posted footage, hadn't spoken to the press, but somehow the silence hit harder than if he had screamed. Brent didn't eat much. He spent hours rereading the articles, the headlines, the letter from his father that had somehow become a symbol of irony for the entire nation. At night, he sat in front of the mirror above the hallway radiator and stared. Sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for hours. It wasn't the public backlash that ate at him. It was the memory. He remembered being 22, fresh out of the academy, with a father who barely spoke but gave everything when it counted. He remembered the heart condition that nearly killed him, the debt his family couldn't cover, the anonymous donor who stepped in like a shadow with a lifeline. It hadn't been just generosity, it had been salvation. And now, realizing who that donor had been, the weight landed differently, like a punch from a ghost. He'd told himself it was about safety, that he had responded by instinct, that he didn't know who was on the lawn that day. But the footage didn't lie, the badge didn't protect, and deep down, even he had stopped believing the excuse he'd built his life around. "I'm not a racist, I'm just doing my job." The storm outside had turned internal. Meanwhile, Shaq sat in the meditation room of his home, a space lined with simple cushions, floor-to-ceiling windows, and no trophies. A sanctuary untouched by performance. He hadn't spoken publicly since Lucille's journal was published. He hadn't needed to. The world was talking, marching, posting, shifting. But he was waiting. Not for revenge, but for clarity. One morning, he sat at the long oak desk and pulled out a single sheet of paper. No emails, no voice notes, just ink and memory. He wrote slowly, not angrily, but purposefully. "Brent, you don't know me, not really. And that's what made this all happen. We were never going to be friends. I don't need that. But we could have respected each other. We could have existed without suspicion. I've spent most of my life being told I'm an exception, an articulate giant, a safe black man. You saw the surface and still couldn't see me. But I saw you. Years ago, I paid your hospital bill. Not because I wanted gratitude, but because I was taught to give even when people don't deserve it. You didn't break me. You just reminded me why I keep doing the work. So here's what I'm offering. I won't press charges. I won't drag this further. But you need to speak. Not to me. To the people you've served. To the kids who look like me. To the communities that know your badge better than they know your name. I want you in schools. I want you in churches. I want you to tell them what you did, and why. If you can do that, if you can own your mirror, then I'll stay quiet. But not because you deserve it, because they do. Shaquille, he folded the letter, sealed it in a simple white envelope, had it delivered not by courier, not by lawyer, but by one of the young volunteers working at his community garden project. A 19-year-old named Langston who didn't even know what he was carrying. All he knew was, Mr. O asked me to hand this to a man who used to wear a badge. Brent opened it without ceremony. He didn't expect forgiveness. He didn't even expect words. But what he got, he couldn't ignore. He read it twice, 3 times. Then, for the first time in days, he stood up and walked into the mirror-lit hallway, not to stare, but to shave. The next morning, Brent sent a single email to the Office of Community Reconciliation. He requested permission to speak at the next city-run youth forum on law enforcement conduct. No press, no legal statement, just presence. 2 weeks later, he took a podium inside a community center on the west side of Atlanta. He wore no uniform, no badge, no scripted apology, just a black shirt and a folded copy of Shaq's letter in his breast pocket. He didn't cry. He didn't excuse. He spoke for 14 minutes. About fear, about assumptions, about the gap between law and humanity, about the lie he told himself for years that he could serve without self-examination. He named no victims, only himself. I became a mirror of a system I never questioned. I treated people like shadows, and the day I tried to erase someone who once saved my life, I realized I had become the very thing I claimed to protect others from. The room stayed quiet. Not cold, just listening. The footage didn't go viral. It wasn't built for views. But it reached the inboxes that mattered. Shaq watched it on his laptop in silence. When it ended, he didn't clap, he didn't smile. He closed the screen, stood, and walked outside where Shawnee was planting rosemary in the garden. He grabbed a shovel and joined her. Because sometimes the real change doesn't come with a bang. It comes when the storm settles and the mirror doesn't crack. He stood behind a podium, trembling, not with fear, but with shame. The cameras were already rolling when Brent Callahan stepped onto the stage. The lights were hot, too hot for a man used to tinted cruiser windows in private halls. The podium was plain, unadorned, no police insignia, no department shield. This wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a redemption tour. It was a reckoning, one that began long before this moment, but could no longer hide behind closed rooms or folded excuses. The auditorium was packed, not with protesters, not with supporters. With witnesses, educators, students, journalists, community organizers, clergy, victims of profiling, former colleagues, everyone who had ever felt the thin line between authority and arrogance, and those who'd stayed silent while watching it blur. A large screen behind him displayed a simple image, a black and white portrait of Lucille O'Neill holding a childhood photo of her son. Next to it, one line pulled from her journal, now known across the country. You don't fight hate with fists, you fight it with memory. Brent swallowed once, adjusted the collar of his navy blue shirt. No uniform today, no tie, just the weight of truth pressing into his chest like a heartbeat out of rhythm. He didn't begin with a statement. He began with silence. Then he said, "My name is Brent Callahan. I was a police officer for 15 years, and for most of that time I believed I was doing the right thing." A hush fell over the room, not the kind that waits for applause, but the kind that readies itself for accountability. I believed I wasn't part of the problem, because I wasn't shouting slurs or planting evidence, because I had black friends, because I didn't mean harm. He paused, fingers lightly gripping the edge of the podium. But intent isn't the same as impact, and assumptions are a quiet form of violence too. He told them about the day in Cedar Hills, about the call he made off-duty, about the language he used, about the part of him that even after years of training still saw 2 black people on a manicured lawn and thought, maybe they don't belong here. The shame wasn't dramatic. It was surgical, stripped of defensiveness, left raw. He went on to admit what the country already knew, how he'd been helped once, saved even by a man he didn't recognize when it counted, how he'd been protected by a system that let his bias stay coded in paperwork and technicalities. His voice trembled, but not out of panic, out of recognition. I thought being a good cop was enough. I thought not being the worst meant I wasn't doing harm. But now I understand, being neutral in a racist system doesn't make you a protector, it makes you a participant. In the third row, Layla Monroe sat scribbling into her notepad, not to tear him down, not to sensationalize, but to capture the exact tone of a man stepping into truth, not heroically, but fully. Brent looked up, eyes scanning the audience, but landing on no one in particular. "I'm not here to be forgiven," he said. "I'm here because the man I wronged asked me to speak, to not run, not hide, but face what I'd been avoiding my whole life. He told me to go where my badge never reached." He pulled a folded paper from his back pocket, the letter. His hands shook just slightly as he unfolded it. "I read this every morning now, not because it lets me off the hook, but because it reminds me who I almost erased." The room remained still. When he stepped away from the podium, no music played, no hands clapped immediately. It wasn't that kind of moment. But slowly, as if moved by something sacred, people rose from their seats, not for performance, for recognition. Brent didn't smile. He simply nodded and exited the stage. Behind the curtain, there was no green room, no handler, just a quiet hallway that led to a staff kitchen, where a bottle of water and a chair waited. He sat, stared at the bottle, and exhaled deep, shaking, not relieved but released. Across town, Shaq watched the broadcast in a quiet conference room at his foundation headquarters. He wasn't alone. His board sat beside him. Young interns on the floor, local pastors behind, Shawnee next to him, her hand over his. He didn't blink. He didn't look away. When Brent finished and walked off stage, Shaq turned to the room. "This isn't closure," he said. "It's ignition." He stood. There are hundreds of other Brents, thousands of other calls, silent files in precinct drawers, kids in neighborhoods being taught how to survive uniforms instead of trust them. He pointed to the interns. "That's who I'm thinking about now. Not him." The boardroom nodded. And with that, Shaq unveiled the initiative he'd been building behind the scenes. Not for revenge, but for redirection. A national program called MIWR, Mentorship, Integrity, Reform, Response, Observation, and Reconnection. A blueprint for pairing former officers with underfunded school districts, inner-city youth, and community-based justice workshops. The condition I gave him wasn't just a personal redemption, Shaq told the room. It was a test. If he could face the mirror, then others could too. And we can build something that doesn't start with punishment, but with purpose. Within a week, major outlets covered Myanmar. Not as a celebrity headline, but as a new framework. Shaq refused interviews. He let educators and activists speak for the initiative. Let Lucille's words form the backbone of its ethics. Meanwhile, Brent began quietly working at one of the pilot programs. No cameras, no profile, just circle groups and awkward introductions. Sometimes met with suspicion, sometimes curiosity. At first, he struggled to speak. The kids didn't trust him, and they shouldn't. But he stayed, showed up every day, took notes, listened more than he talked. One day, a boy named Reggie, 12, angry, brilliant, stood in front of him and asked, "You the cop who cuffed that tall dude's wife?" Brent nodded.
"Then why you here?"
Brent looked the boy in the eye and said, "To unlearn what I thought I knew." Reggie blinked, shrugged. "You better not mess this up," and walked off. Brent stayed sitting there for a while, not because he was shaken, because he knew Reggie was right. In Cedar Hills, the lawn at the O'Neill estate began to regrow where the crowd had once stood. A new community garden was planted in the corner lot. Kids came after school to help. Shawnee taught them how to pot herbs. Shaq didn't speak about Brent again. He didn't need to. His silence wasn't the absence of justice. It was the presence of something deeper. Progress, planted, watered, and watched. Injustice had a name, but now so did redemption. The first shipment of books arrived in brown cardboard boxes, stacked 6 high in the back of Layla Monroe's office. No fanfare, no red ribbon, just ink, weight, and truth. On the cover, a black and white photograph of a cracked sidewalk in front of the O'Neill estate, the outline of a protest sign still faintly visible on the pavement. The title ran across the top in bold serif font, "The Day Cedar Hills Cried," by Layla Monroe. The subtitle, smaller but heavier, read, "A True Story of Fear, Silence, and the Seeds of Change." It wasn't a bestseller yet, but it didn't need to be. It was already required reading in 5 school districts by pre-order alone. Advance copies had been sent to social justice institutes, to political roundtables, to high schools and community centers from Atlanta to Oakland. What began as an assignment had become a record, not of drama, but of evolution. Layla didn't write herself as a hero. She wrote herself as a witness. She let the story breathe through other voices. Shawnee's quiet defiance, Brent's stumbling redemption, Lucille's timeless journal entries, and above all Shaq's resolve. His refusal to play savior, victim, or avenger. His quiet insistence on presence. She opened chapter 1, with a line that mirrored the beginning, but carried a deeper edge now. The truth didn't arrive with sirens. It walked through a gate carrying a watering can. As copies of the book circulated, the narrative began to expand beyond Cedar Hills. Across gated communities, town hall meetings began with excerpts from Lucille's journal. One principal in Mississippi read a passage during a graduation ceremony. A podcast series based on the events reached 3 on national charts. Its theme music wasn't aggressive or dramatic. It was the soft hum of a Georgia morning, layered with wind through trees and children laughing faintly in the background. The story was no longer about what happened. It was about how people responded after it did. Shaq never did a national interview. He declined every appearance request, every documentary pitch, every magazine spread. But he kept showing up in real ways. He launched a discreet emergency fund for wrongfully profiled families, managed through his foundation but not branded with his name. He paid off the mortgage for a single mother in Baton Rouge who'd been falsely evicted after a neighbor called in a false complaint. He funded a digital literacy lab in Detroit for teens navigating biased media systems. Each project had one rule: no spotlight. Shawnee, meanwhile, joined the advisory board for a restorative justice initiative that trained suburban districts in de-escalation and bias recognition. Her first seminar began with a photo of her front lawn, where everything had begun. "I didn't expect to be handcuffed," she told the group. "But what shook me more was how many people believed I deserved to be." She didn't linger on trauma. She focused on pattern, prevention, and accountability. It became her mission. Lucille's journals sold out in hardcover within 3 weeks, but the proceeds didn't go into memoir tours or speaking fees. She used the royalties to establish the O'Neill Archive for Lived Memory, a digital platform collecting personal stories of racial encounters across America, each voice verified, each story preserved. No edits, no disclaimers, just unfiltered remembrance. "People say justice is blind," she said during the launch, "but memory has perfect vision." Brent Callahan kept his head down. After his public address, he relocated to a nearby city and joined a conflict transformation program as a junior staffer. His job wasn't glamorous. He arranged chairs, took notes, passed out agendas, but he listened. He showed up, and he never wore his old badge again. He'd written a letter to Shaq after his first year in the program, not to seek approval, just to acknowledge growth. "I can't undo what I did, but I can make sure I never look away again. Thank you for forcing me into the light." Shaq didn't reply, but he read it, folded it, and placed it next to the original hospital letter from Brent's father, now laminated and kept in a locked drawer. Not out of sentiment, out of record. Harvest Court continued to grow. The garden wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Every season brought something new. The benches were now carved with quotes from local kids. The entryway was lined with framed photos from the community. Hands in dirt, faces in sunlight, arms around shoulders. No gate surrounded it anymore. People came and went freely. Students brought field trips. College professors used it for study projects. Retired officers volunteered beside high schoolers without awkwardness. The land had shifted. So had the people. Cedar Hills, once a fortress of polite intolerance, had become a mirror for neighborhoods across the country. Its story became a case study, not for scandal, but for possibility. In the final pages of her book, Layla Monroe wrote, "The people of Cedar Hills never expected to be part of a national conversation, but they were forced to look in the mirror and chose not to look away." And on the very last page, beneath a faded image of Lucille sitting beneath the garden willow, a final sentence stood alone, drawn from her most echoed line. "You don't fight hate with fists, you fight it with memory." When asked what she hoped readers would take from her book, Layla answered simply, "Cedar Hills wasn't a tragedy. It was an awakening." She smiled, paused, and added, "But the real story? It was never about the badge, it was about the garden." And it was. If this story shook something in you, don't let it settle. Talk about it at your table. Share it in spaces that stay too quiet. Plant truth where it's never been rooted. Because silence protects systems, but stories shift them. And this story is just the beginning. Cedar Hills never had a Black community meeting, until now. Cedar Hills had never hosted a community meeting open to the public. especially not one centered on race. For decades, the gates did their job. They didn't just keep strangers out, they kept discomfort out, change out, questions out. The community newsletter stayed focused on landscaping tips and brunch photos. Security patrols followed routes designed for optics, not outcomes. Homeowners' meetings rarely lasted more than 30 minutes, and the loudest debates had always been about paint shades or mailbox uniformity. But that changed the day a folding chair was placed at the center of the main cul-de-sac. One chair, then two, then a circle. No podium, no HOA lanyards, just a handwritten sign taped to a lamppost. Community voices, 3 p.m., no microphones, no masks, just truth. Shaq didn't organize it. He didn't even suggest it. A woman named Ruth Chapman did, an 82-year-old widow who'd lived in Cedar Hills since 1974. The first to raise her eyebrows at the O'Neills, and the first to walk across the street with a lemon pie 2 weeks after Shawnee's detainment. I was wrong, she told her friends afterward. I don't want to be remembered for staying quiet. So she pulled out her garage's old aluminum chairs and made calls to neighbors she barely knew anymore. Some hung up, some laughed, but some showed up. By 3 o'clock, there were 26 people in the circle. By 3:15, there were 50, and by 4 the circle had to split into 2 smaller ones to give everyone space to speak. It wasn't perfect. The first 20 minutes were clumsy. People stuttered, talked over one another, used language that revealed more than they meant to, but no one walked away. No one stormed off. And that, in Cedar Hills, was revolution. Shaq stood quietly under an oak tree at the edge of the lawn, listening. Not towering above them, just present. Watching the same community that once filed noise complaints about his backyard music, now asking questions like, what does community policing actually mean? Why don't we have a black teacher at the local elementary? What would it take to make this neighborhood feel welcoming instead of just safe? When Ruth offered him the chance to speak, Shaq declined. I've said enough in silence, he told her. But Shawnee stepped forward. She didn't lecture, didn't defend. She simply said, you don't have to understand everything to start listening. Just don't wait until it's your family. And then she sat back down. That sentence rippled. 3 days later, the HOA board announced it was partnering with the city's Office of Equity and Community Healing to review policing guidelines inside gated neighborhoods. For the first time, Cedar Hills would allow third-party auditing of its private security practices, including racial bias training and complaint tracking. No one clapped, but no one pushed back either. The quiet was a new kind of agreement. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened at the O'Neill estate. Shaq and Shawnee removed a section of the iron perimeter fence, the side facing the southern slope, once shielded by thick hedges. In its place, they built a wide, arched entryway lined with sandstone, with a sign that read, Harvest Court, Open Garden, all welcome, no ID required. It wasn't symbolic, it was functional. Raised beds stretched across the slope in neat rows. Herbs, tomatoes, collard greens, eggplant, peppers, strawberries. A tool shed stood at the back, painted by local middle schoolers in vibrant murals of roots and suns, and outstretched hands. Every Saturday morning, they opened the garden. Kids from downtown came with their parents. Elderly couples from Cedar Hills strolled in for the first time, unsure whether to offer help or just stand and admire. Teenagers showed up with skateboards and left with watering cans. Nobody asked what anyone did for a living. Nobody wore a badge. Shaq didn't host. He participated. Hands in the dirt, knees in the soil, quietly showing what growth could look like, not metaphorically, but literally. The garden became something else too, a place for dialogue. After harvests, people sat on the benches and talked, not just about race, but about loss, about parenting, about fear, about the time they'd been misunderstood or had misunderstood someone else. Lucille came once, wearing a wide sun hat and carrying a mason jar of lemonade. She sat beneath the willow tree and read from her journal aloud to a group of volunteers. She chose this entry. I don't need them to like us. I need them to see us, fully, without suspicion, without performance, just us. Someone recorded it. The video went viral, again. But the garden wasn't a backdrop for content. It was a blueprint. A few weeks later, the city announced a pilot initiative based on Harvest Court. Other gated communities began reaching out. Not all responded with openness, but enough to shift the conversation. Shaq received letters from homeowners in other states asking how they could replicate the idea. His reply was always the same. Start with one patch of land, let the fences down, the rest will follow. Back in Cedar Hills, the neighborhood newsletter took a new turn. Its front page was no longer just seasonal recipes and golf tournament photos. It included a column called The Listening Post, where anonymous residents could submit questions or stories related to community equity, inclusion, and history. One submission read, "I never realized I held bias until I saw how afraid I was of change. I'm still learning, but I'm grateful for the mirror." Anonymous 21 Hawthorne. Brent Callahan never moved back into the neighborhood, but he came once to volunteer at Harvest Court on a quiet Sunday. He didn't wear anything identifying, just jeans and a plain t-shirt. He trimmed hedges in silence, until a young boy approached and offered him a handful of cherry tomatoes in a paper towel. "Thanks, mister." Brent smiled, nodded, and accepted them without speaking. Across the path, Shaq saw him. Their eyes met. No nod, no wave. Just understanding. That was enough. As the sun dipped lower, painting the garden in gold and rose, Shaq looked out at what had once been a sealed-off community where whispers traveled faster than truth. Now there were children running along the rows of kale and cabbage, retirees swapping compost tips with teenagers, a young mother setting down a cooler of homemade lemonade beside a sign that read, "Take what you need, give what you can, no judgment." The gate had opened, not just physically, but emotionally. Cedar Hills would never be perfect. It didn't need to be. But it was no longer untouched. It was no longer silent. And in its imperfection, it had finally started to grow.